The Bank of Canada has sent the Canadian dollar absolutely tanking. The Canadian dollar is hitting 2-year lows right now. And where the heck is it going from here? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, it's worth noting here, and we're going to get into this, the mainstream media is starting to pick up the story about this. And when the mainstream media picks up a story like this, it's generally a time when you're actually going to see some kind of bounce here. And I would kind of expect that where it is right now. So it's sitting right at the lows here. It's actually broke this low here. But if you go back, you have to go all the way back here, all the way to 2022. Funnily enough, October as well. And that is when it last put in a low down here. And then the low for 2022 is also there around 71.58. And we are really not too far away from that low. So if I actually zoom in on this chart, just so you can see it's actually broke here, you can see that this wick, it did actually trade below that. So it set a new 2-year low there. So this bar, I can now move it to here. And this is the new 2-year low. And I don't know why, but other mainstream media articles have been pointing out and saying that, oh, it's at a 5-year low, it's at a 4-year low. I mean, yes, it depends which chart you're using really, and it depends which price you're looking at, but I would say it's really at the 2-year low. So we really have to watch what happens here. It's going to be very interesting, and it's at a crucial point where you want to be watching what happens. So you could see a bounce and it could go on a nice rally, which actually happened here throughout the summer. You saw the Canadian dollar, it got all the way up to nearly 75 cents, around 74.50, and now we're down at 71.86 and the low is at 71.71. So that really is a low for the Canadian dollar, in 71.58. If you break that, you've got a lot of room, and it goes all the way down here on this chart to 68.20 is the next low. So if you break this low here of 71.58, you could be heading to 68 cents, which would just be an absolute disaster for Canadians. But you do have to wonder how many people actually watch the Canadian dollar outside of the finance space. That's something I'm really interested about. So if you leave a comment into this stream, just leave a comment saying, are any of your friends, your family members talking about the Canadian dollar being so weak? Or is it mainly just people who follow finance who are looking into this stuff? Because I would just assume it's mostly people in finance that know about this, and the average Joe and Jane don't. However, the mainstream media is starting to pick up on this story right now, which does make me suspicious that we're going to see a bounce here. That's usually what happens. So the loonie is trading at lows not seen in years. Here's what it means for Canadians. And when I say it may take a bounce here, that doesn't mean it's not heading lower. I think the trend is obvious here. You do not have to be a rocket scientist. We're in this trend that is ever lower lows right now. I don't think that's going to change. But does that mean that you can't see a rally like we saw in the summer off these lows? No, you've set a new low, so that is bearish for the Canadian dollar, but you could still see a nice rally off here, or it could break it further, which means there's even more weakness in there, and then you could fall down to this 68 cents level, which would be a disaster for the Canadian dollar. So let's see what the mainstream media is saying about this. Canada's currency sunk below 72 cents US on Monday for the first time in more than 4 years, breaking through the 72 to 76 band that it has been trading within in recent months. The loonie fell further on Tuesday and continued to inch down on Wednesday, closing at 71.86, and obviously we've seen lower since then. What's driving down the currency? They say the biggest driver of the split between the Canadian and US dollar is the diverging economic outlooks. I would tend to agree with that. The US economy is stronger, but the world right now believes the US economy is resilient. They even mention that in here, which I don't think it is. I think you're going to see the US economy start to falter as we move on in time here. And I think a lot of the economic data that is coming out because of the election is extremely distorted, and you'll see that revised in the future. And I don't think we'll see anything happen big until after the election, but I wouldn't be surprised if the US economy was in a recession right now. Canada Canada, obviously, we know is like heading into a depression, essentially. So Canadian economic growth is looking weaker than the US, leading the Bank of Canada to cut its key interest rate by an unusually high 0.5 percentage point to 3.75%. It was the fourth consecutive cut by the central bank, and economists expect continued cuts ahead. With the US economy seeing stronger growth, there's less pressure and expectations of the path to lower rates from the US Federal Reserve. I would kind of tend to agree with that, but they can flip and change their tune. If you look at the history of rate cuts and rate hikes, I mean, it's all there. Once they start cutting, it generally happens pretty fast after that. And that's because the economy is actually starting to collapse. And I think under the surface, that's already happening in the US. It's obviously happening in Canada. It's blatantly obvious to all of us on this channel. But yeah, it's very interesting, actually, what they say here. So the US economy feels a lot more resilient. I mean, you could copy and paste and put that in like 10 different articles, because you hear this almost constantly, this term, the US economy is resilient. It's really just shows you how they're all in sync, the mainstream media. So the assumption is that they're not pressured. The Fed isn't pressured to reduce rates as much as it is in Canada. Crude oil prices have fallen recently, down below $70 a barrel, to also weigh on the loonie. I don't think it really trades with crude oil anymore. This has been debunked several times. I mean, you only have to compare the price chart. However, would it put a tailwind or a headwind on the Canadian dollar? Absolutely. It's one of many factors. Currency markets are extremely complicated, but it's one of many factors. So there's also increasing election trade betting that Trump will win, also putting pressure on the Canadian dollar. He said the potential for trade wars and downward oil price pressure if he does win is also helping boost the US dollar. Yeah, so I mean, the crazy thing to me is, like, let's say you have global financial crisis 2.0, which is definitely coming. It's definitely coming. We saw the start of this with the banking crisis in the US. This is far from over. Just look at what's happening in China. You know, this is only just getting started. So when this eventually happens, if the Canadian dollar is trading down near the lows where it is, we know the DXY is going to surge and the dollar is going to surge. It's always the fear trade, is people piling into the dollar. And what's that going to mean for the Canadian dollar? I mean, it could just crater to new lows. I mean, it's just insane how far this could really go. So the Canadian dollar is just not in a good place. And what I mean is, when you actually look at the chart here of where we are, and if I put this to a weekly chart here so you can see it. So this goes all the way back to 2022. So you can see the band that the Globe and Mail talks about where it's been trading for pretty much the past 5 years, they've said, but it's not really. It's really since 2022. And yeah, it's been stuck in this band, but you're now down at this level. So let's say something happens that we don't know about and you're down here and you get that dollar fear trade. Well, where does the currency head then? It heads right down. Because why was it down here in October of 2022? Do any of you remember? Because I remember that. I can't forget that. That was the gilt market blow up in the UK. The UK currency was absolutely crashing at that time. And if you look at what's unfolded since, I think that's really interesting dynamic to look at as well, because it crashed all the way to a 1980, 1990s low, but then it went on a hell of a rally. So sometimes these crashes, when they eventually get to the apex moment, can actually be a great time to buy into that. I'm not saying we're anywhere near that right now, but it's definitely something to think about, and something that I think you just see in all markets, quite frankly. They just get oversold. So anyway, we just have to continue to monitor when it gets down to these lows, what happens. I do think we're oversold here and we're due a bounce. Obviously, the markets have baked in pretty much everything that's going to happen. The Bank of Canada's rate cut was no surprise. And in fact, I was expecting a bigger rate cut than that, which didn't happen. happen. So it's very interesting, and we'll have to see moving forward whether there's any things that happen that weren't expected, because that's when you're going to see more and more weakness come into the Canadian dollar. It's also worth noting that US data also heavily impacts the Canadian dollar either way. And it doesn't mean because you get a negative report that you are going to see the currency tank. In fact, it can go the opposite ways. And I've actually back tested many strategies on this, and the odds are around 50-50. So if you think you get some bad news and the currency is going to tank, well, actually, it's just a 50-50 chance. There's no strategy. There's no form of trade apart from very, very, very short term, maybe. We'll have to continue to monitor what happens here. Guys, I want to thank you so much for watching this live stream. If you want to watch another great video here, I would highly recommend that you check out this video here. And if you want to help support the channel and get yourself protected with a VPN, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. That's the VPN that I use. And I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.